Well, we are now into the final chapters of Job, getting to the pointy end of the story. We've been looking at the overall themes of the book and working through sections of this book. And we are into the final hurrah, if you will, to the famous chapters, the chapters that everybody seems to know when they talk about the book of Job. They know the beginning of the book, that Job suffered. Not sure exactly what's going on in the middle, but those last chapters, everybody seems to have them down pat on what's going on. So needless to say, we are rounding up into those final chapters. I've mentioned this to you, that what his friends have been doing, what this book has been doing, what Elihu has done, is try to give some measure of a theodicy. I mentioned this word a couple weeks ago. Everybody has a theodicy, whether you know it or not. It is your explanation on how you put together a good God with the existence of so-called evil. Evil just in a generic broad brush sense, not necessarily spiritual evil, but natural evil, human evil, all measures of evil from stub toes to sudden deaths. How do you explain that? Many people would just say, well, it's obvious evidence that God does not exist. We've talked about this through the book, and all that they're trying to do is come up with an answer. Job is about to get, in these final chapters, a rounded explanation that may not satisfy some of us, but it's the answer that Job gets. You know the cycle. You know how we talked about this, how they go through, his friends go through over 3 times, talking through their ideas of what the reasons are that Job is suffering. Elihu, we talked about him last week, brings Job to silence. Elihu's response is unlike the other friends. Elihu seems to be declaring something. He adds something new to the book. He has 6 full chapters of declaring that God uses suffering to open the ears of men, to soften hearts, to cause people to be sensitive to spiritual things. He opens their ears, terrifies them with warning that he may turn man aside from his deed, whatever deed that might be, and keep his pride, conceal pride from man, pride that dominates him. He uses fear, he uses circumstances, he uses things to quicken the heart of man, to make him sensitive to the voice of God, and to make him consider things beyond himself. That really is the first part of the answer of Job's theodicy. As I was looking at this passage, I remembered this little comic from Peanuts. Linus and Lucy are looking out the window and pouring rain. Boy, look at it rain. What if it floods the whole world? Linus says, it will never do that. In the 9th chapter of Genesis, God promised Noah that would never happen again, and the sign of the promise is in the rainbow. Lucy responds, you've taken a great load off my mind. Linus says, sound theology has a way of doing that. There's a great truth to that. Sound theology brings peace to your mind. And that is all that Job is looking for. And that is all that Job is grasping at. And that is all that Job receives in the final chapters. He gets his answer, and it's found in the character of God. I've tried to stress this through the book, that our biggest problem when it comes to pain and suffering is that our eyes automatically fall to ourselves. This is just human who we are. This is how we are. I'm not rebuking anyone. This is how we respond. But at the end of the day, the answers are found in the character of God. That may not make sense to you, but this is certainly what Job discovers. And just a quick understanding of how this book wraps up. Chapters 38 to 41 is God speaking, and Job responds in Job 42. Job repents. This is sort of how the book comes to an end. Job has been looking for an explanation for the reason that he's suffering. And instead of getting an explanation, he gets a revelation. The book says this: the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Interesting phrase. Elihu had just been talking about how God uses the storm and uses it to soften hard hearts, and uses weather to bring people an awareness of something otherly, get a end of days feeling about a great storm, and they start to think about things beyond themselves. And now out of this whirlwind, God speaks. Why a whirlwind? There's some mystery here that's going on. It's interesting language. We don't need to spend too much time sorting this out. But this is not a still small voice, is what we know. That this is a loudness, a serious response of God. He said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" He knows that Job has been formulating his case against God and declaring that he believes that God has made a mistake, that God is in error. He is just, but he is being unjust and unfair because there's no reason that Job should be suffering. And he knows that Job has his case, and so he asks, why are you making a case without any full knowledge? Dress for action. Interesting phrase, this. Literally in the Hebrew, it's gird up your loins. This is a wrestling phrase. This is used of somebody who needs to go into action in a fight. And any woman here will tell you that it's difficult to fight in a dress. So what you do, as you're wearing a robe in the ancient East, you would gird up your loins. You would get ready for action. You would hike up whatever is entangling your ankles, and you would tie that around, you would tuck that in, you would get yourself set, and you were ready to wrestle. That's the phrase. Get ready, but the wrestling match here is not a wrestling match of physicality. It's a wrestling match of wisdom, of words, of thoughts. Job, dress for action. Get ready. I will question you. These are the rules to the wrestling match. I'm going to question you. You answer me. This is not what Job was expecting. Job was ready to question God, and now the tables are turned. He was ready to put all of his questions at God. How dare you? How could you do this? Why? What's the matter with you? Aren't you wrong? Why did you what? He's going to ask all his questions, and instead now the tables are totally turned. I'm asking you the questions. You're going to answer me. There are about 60 plus questions in the following chapters, and if you know the text, you know well that Job is unable to answer any of them. The answer to every question is simply, I don't know. Here's the questions. In an overall summary, kind of overarching look at this text, the questions are related to the structure of the world, the maintenance of the world. These are kind of the two areas where God touches over these chapters as he begins to express his ideas to Job. And this is very curious. Job is looking for an answer on why I am suffering in pain. Why has this bad thing happened to me, the undeserved, as experiencing this agony? And what does he get for an answer? The structure of the world and the maintenance of the world. What? This was the last thing Job was listening for, and the last thing oftentimes that we would ever dream to find an answer to our questions as we formulate our theodicy. The questions run along these lines. Can you explain my creation? Can you govern my creation? They kind of fall into these two categories. There's a third one which we will look at together next week. Here's a question one. Were you there? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Goes right back to creation. Where were you? Did I ask your opinion? When I laid the foundation of the earth, tell me if you have any understanding of how this happened. Were you there, Job? So what do you know about it? Which, by the way, strikes at the heart of our naturalism today that speaks about it as if somebody was there and they actually saw what happened and they know what happened and nobody was and nobody does. And that is why Revelation is as legitimate as any other guess. Who measured? Here's the question. Who measured? Who determined its measurements? He's talking about plans and blueprints. He's talking about this as if God, at creation, did nothing nilly-willy. This was thought out. This was organized. This was thought through. This was mathematical. This was intelligent. Did I ask for your opinion? Did I get you to hold the other end of the measuring tape when we figured out how big the earth should be? How much of an iron core, of a magnetic core that the earth needed to sustain itself? How far away from the sun that it needed to be in order to sustain life? How big should the moon be in relation to the earth so that it could sustain life? How close should the moon be to the sun, to the earth, and all in symmetry? Did I ask your opinion? Who measured, who determined its measurements? Surely you know, since you seem to know everything, Job. Or who stretched the line upon it? Who took the measuring line? Who took the other end of the measuring tape? On what were its bases sunk? How is the planet Earth hanging in space? Who laid its cornerstone? Who started this work? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Tell me, Job, do you know? Or who shut in the sea with doors? I have to just give you a quick understanding. The ancient Semites had an idea that the sea was the original source, the original element of the world. It's a mythology of the ancient East. This is not suggesting that Job believed this, but God is just using what they understood. And the sea, as you know, as what I've told you, the sea from the Jewish mind was a place of all darkness. In fact, it was the place where death happened. Death's doors were at the bottom of the sea. This was just a common thought. It wasn't actually believed necessarily to be true, but it was a euphemism. It was an idea that everything in the sea was dark and evil, and it was uncontrollable. Uncontrollable, and nobody could stop a wave from doing what a wave wanted to do. If a wave came in and crashed, you took your boat out. There's no way to control these things. The sea was dark, mysterious, and uncontrollable. But God speaks as if the whole thing is perfectly under his control. Who shut the sea in with doors? I control the sea. When it burst out from its womb. So he gives the impression that God's talking about the birth. He's talking about a birth of the sea, the creation of the sea. I was there. And I controlled this wild thing that you think is uncontrollable. When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, you can see the metaphor of birthing. Coming out of the womb, and then clouds the garment and swaddling clothes of the water cycle. I created all this thing. I can pick up a lake, carry it over here and let it fall over here. Do you know how that works, Job? Do you know why that works, Job? Do you know who put that in charge, Job? And prescribed limits for it. And set bars and doors and said, thus far you shall come and no further. Why does the sea only come to the edge of the land? The tides come in and thus no further, and then they set their limits and they go out. Why? Here is the last phrase. And here your proud waves shall be stayed. Who thought that up? Who created the system, Job, whereby the sea is actually seemingly to you out of control, but I actually have full and absolute control over all that happens with the sea? There's a system, Job. There's a timing to it, Job. Did this mathematical formula just happen on its own? Is that a fluke? Did nature create itself, Job? Have you entered into the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail? This is metaphorical language. You know this is not scientific language. God doesn't have a cupboard where he's got buckets of snow. It's just picture words. It's poetry. Have you gone to the place? Do you know, Job, how snow is made? This is not saying, will anybody ever understand this? Can we ever know this? He's asking Job to explain what to him would be something he would have no way of knowing. Have you entered into the storehouses of the snow? Let me ask you this. Since we're Muskokans and we know what snow looks like and we know it well, where right now, this is a weird question, but answer me this is what Job's being asked. Where is the snow that's going to fall next January? Where is that snow right now? I don't know. What a stupid question. That's the question that Job was just asked. Where is the next snowfall coming from? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail? Where does hail come from, Job? I know exactly where it's going to go and where it's going to fall. In fact, as the text even says, let me read verse 23, which I reserve for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. We even see this in Joshua 10. God's enemies, God's people are battling. This is a theocracy, and they're in theocracy, and they're in battle with the Ammonites. As they fled before Israel while they were going down to the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azek. Now, the language of Scripture always uses human language. God's not sitting up there with these in his hands and he's whipping them down at people. You understand that? But it attributes what happens with the weather to come from God's hand. If it happened in the weather, then God did it. That is how the language of the Old Testament so closely relates the natural to the supernatural. The Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azek, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. God has a storehouse of hail for his own purposes. Job, what do you know about this? Has the rain a father? Well, there's an interesting question. I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be, and I know there's one in the room, so I don't want to pretend to say anything that just makes me look more stupid than I already am. But let me ask you this. How is it that two gases, oxygen and hydrogen, have come together to create water? Do you know how that works? As far as I understand, we still don't know how to create water from two gases. As far as I know, we have no idea who fathered water. How this happened and the mechanism that brought these two things together to create a third. Now, if that's incorrect, then I'm willing to be corrected. But at the time of Job, Job certainly knew nothing of this. And that's the question. How is it, Job, where did water come from? Who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb? Again, the picture of birthing something. From whose womb? This is a creation. It's not an accident. From whose womb did the ice come forth? Now, Job would know perhaps very little, if anything, of ice. Living in the ancient Near East, very warm all the time, practically all the time, would have seen snow on the top of the mountains, perhaps had traveled and seen ice, but where does ice come from? Who built the law into the universe that when 0 degrees Celsius is reached, then water freezes to a solid? Two gases that become a liquid become a solid. Who wrote that into the universe? Job? Where did this idea come from? How does that happen? Why does that happen? Is that just natural, Job? Did nature make itself, Job, as 21st century man likes to continually preach the mantra and believe and tell to himself that it just happened on its own volition? Nothing comes from nothing. Every cause is because every effect has a cause. Who has given birth to the frost of heaven? The waters become hard like stone. If you were ever on the lake in January, you know exactly what that's like. The face of the deep is frozen. Who created that idea? Where did that come from, Job? This is his answer to the reason of his suffering. Can you lift the voice to the clouds and that a flood of waters may cover you? You know, Job lived in a dry, arid place. And the fact that anybody could speak to the clouds in the middle of a drought and ask for rain to come would have been like everybody wanted to do that. Can you speak to the clouds, Job, when it's dry and you need your crops to grow, and ask for rain that the flood of waters may cover you? Job, what's your answer? I think we know what it is. The answer's so obvious, Job remains silent as any one of us would. Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are, lightning which appears to be random to our naked eye? Can you control it to make it hit the mark that you've decided where it should land? What's the answer, Job? The implication is if we could control weather patterns, we would only do it for our benefit. We will believe that we could do a better job of it than God. Who has put wisdom in the inner parts? This phrase, I can't help but see just so much of the intricacies of the genius of the world that we live in. We speak too little of this, really, and I know too little of it myself. But the wisdom of the way that this world works, it is almost beyond our comprehension how intricately detailed the systems are on this planet, that all function together with brilliance. One thing that I've always remembered from high school that still just stuck with me, I'm just fascinated by this. In a world that is so-called random, that happened by chance, it has always puzzled me why the angle of incidence always equals the angle of reflection. Do you know what I mean? If you hit a baseball against the wall, throw a baseball against the wall, the angle that it hits that wall will exactly determine the angle that it leaves that wall. 100% of the time, all the time, the angle angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. We know this to such a degree that we actually have created a game based on this physical principle in the universe. You cannot play pool except that the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. If it was random in the universe and everything happened by chance, and this law was not written down for all time in the great wisdom of God in the secret places, then the game of pool would be pointless. You do math in your head whether you know it or not. Every time you strike the ball, you're trying to figure out if I hit at this angle. You know what should happen, and the reason it didn't was not because the angle in the math was messed up, because you hit it in the wrong place. And that's where the skill comes, to learn and to figure out your angles that are written into the universe. Who wrote that math into the universe so that it is a constant and a continual? By the way, this isn't true 100% of the time. Because if light reflects into water, then it's not reflection, it's refraction. And there's another law. And you know how that looks because you've stuck your fishing rod or a stick into the water and you've seen the illusion that it looks like it's bent. It's not bent, but light refracts differently through another substance, and it is following mathematical laws. Who wrote those laws into sunlight to behave that way? Did you know that there are creatures who know this math better than you and I? You may have heard of the archer fish. I find this so fascinating. An archer fish is a fish that shoots water from its mouth to catch a bug that is above the surface of the water. So when it sees the bug, the fish will swim underneath the insect, but it's actually not seeing the insect where it is in reality because light refracts underwater. But the fish does the math. And it knows the bug appears to be here, so I know it's here. And it shoots a jet of water from its mouth and hits the bug so that the bug drops off of the leaf and into the mouth of the fish. And it knows how to do this with 100% accuracy, no matter how high the bug is. It can find the insect at every level and always hits it with the exact amount of pressure. It even calculates for gravity. It even knows that the arc of the stream will begin to fall, and it calculates gravity into its spouting of the water. It can shoot straight up. It can shoot at every angle. It always finds its mark. Who put the math in the mind of a fish? I can't figure that out. And this thing just does that like it's nobody's business. Who has put wisdom in the inner parts or given understanding to the mind? It's a question of epistemology. How can you know that you know what you know? I don't know. How does your mind work? How is it that you can know things? How that you can know things so that you can rely on those things that you know? How do you know that you know that you know something? How does that work? How does consciousness work? Where does this come from, Job? Were you there when any of this came to be? Then he begins to talk not only about his creation, but his maintenance of creation. Do you know about the mountain goats that give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? This is probably most likely the Nubian ibex, we would call it in our context. It's a mountain goat of the Middle East, would have been known to Job, and it was not a domesticated animal. There is a theme in the animals that God chooses to draw Job's attention to. This mountain goat lives in the mountains and does not serve any purpose for any farmer. They do not milk these goats. They do not eat them for meat. They do not raise these goats. They do their own thing on their own. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Do you know the gestation period of a mountain goat? Well, I don't. It doesn't mean we couldn't figure it out. That's not the question. Job, why does this happen without your say-so? How does this happen without you stepping in, since you seem to know everything that should and shouldn't happen, and you know that this shouldn't have happened to you? Then how is it that this is happening without you knowing anything about it? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Do you know the time when they give birth, when they crouch and bring forth their offspring and are delivered of their young? Did they ask for your help out in the wilderness when they're about to give birth? Do you know anything about these wild creatures that I look after that are doing their own thing? Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I have given the arid plain for his home and the salt land for his dwelling place. Who has let the wild donkey go free? This would most likely and most certainly have been the onager. We call it the onager. It didn't get that name until 1775. It was a wild donkey for years and years. This is most likely a wild donkey of the Middle East. It can run up to 70 kilometers an hour. It has never been domesticated. It has no earthly purpose, politely said. We cannot tame these things. You cannot catch these things. They do nothing for the human race whatsoever. They are running free and running wild, and God asks Job, why? Why are there animals here that are just running around for their own entertainment and not for your purposes? Why? Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger? He's a wild ox, so clearly he's not going to spend a night at your manger. Can you bind him in the furrows with ropes? Can you put a yoke on him and use him for your own purposes? Will he harrow the valleys after you? The wild ox of the Middle East is now extinct. Massive, massive animal. They say that the shoulder width from shoulder to shoulder of this ox was 6 feet. This was a brute of a beast. Never been domesticated. Always lived in the wild. And again, served no human purpose. If we could have harnessed this thing, it would have transformed what we built and accomplished. It would have ripped trees down from fields. It was, pardon the pun, this thing would have been a bulldozer. And we would have learned to harness its strength with, leather straps and a whip and make it do things that no human being could do, to clear lands and pull down trees and do all kinds of work in our fields as, agricultural people in the ancient Near East. Nobody used the wild ox. All of its strength was wasted from a human perspective. Job, since you know all, and you're questioning why I am allowing suffering in your life, why did I create an animal that is so great and so strong and no human being can tap into its resource? Why does that animal exist? What is its purpose? From a human perspective, you would ask, why does it exist? The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but they are the pinions and plumage of love, for she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that the wild beast may trample them. Have you ever looked at an ostrich? It looks like a moose. It looks like it was made from leftovers. I mean, the thing is just great bulbous body, skinny little legs, little tiny wings that don't allow it to fly. And then it lays its eggs. It doesn't even bother to build its nest. Just plops its eggs down on the ground and leaves them. So any wild beast could just come and trample them. If you could do that to an ostrich egg, which of course is extremely hardy. Skinny little legs, by the way, that can outrun a horse. It can't fly. It's ugly as all get out. Job, why? I don't know, Job would have said. I don't know. Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. Who's put the wild in the wild horse? Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings towards the south? Who put the knowledge of migration in a bird? Who did that, Job? Is it at your command that the eagles mount up and makes his nest high? Who put the instinct in an eagle to always build their nests in the same place? Have you ever noticed that they don't get together and discuss what they're going to do, but they all do the same thing? There's never a rogue eagle that suddenly decides, I think I'd like to try this on the ground this year. No, they don't do that. Who put this knowledge in the bird? Why does it do this? We would ask this, I would think of monarch butterflies. This fascinates me. How do these things know how to get to Mexico when they've never been to Mexico before? And every year, they fly back to the very same region without anybody ever giving them a map. They never learned this from their parents. They never had anybody tell them, whisper in their ear, what part of Mexico they were supposed to land on. And every single monarch ends up in the same place. Job, how do they do that? Who put that in them? Where did that come from? Well, it's needless to say, Job's answer is rather obvious. The Lord said to Job, "Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty?" That's exactly what Job is. He's decided he'd found fault with God. God had no right to allow this to happen. He was wrong. It was unfair. He was ready to tell God that he was unfair. And you're going to tell me, Job, you don't even know how this world works. And you're going to tell me that something's not working right. You don't understand half of what's going on in this world, and you think you know why evil shouldn't happen to you. He who argues with God, let him answer to it. I think any one of us would know that we'd be caught short. We live in the first generation of people that were able to see an actual photo of Mars. I know, nobody cares. That's kind of weird. We are the first generation of people. I Googled for the very first picture ever taken on Mars, and my understanding is this is the picture. Okay? This was the human race's first glimpse at this red planet. How much have we learned about the world since the time of Job? It's enormous what we've learned. And yet, you tell me that even yet, we've got it all nailed down. We barely know what this planet is like, let alone every other planet just in our puny little solar system, let alone all the other solar systems in the universe. How much don't we know? That's what God's asking Job. And Job answered the Lord and said, "Behold, I am of small account. And what shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, I will not answer twice. I will proceed no further." What's Job's answer? It's curious, isn't it? Job has waited for a moment to talk to God. Why am I suffering unfairly? I want an explanation. What does he get? He gets 65 plus questions, riddled one after another. Do you know this? Do you know this? Do you know this? Do you know this? What kind of an answer is that? What is this doing? It's humbling Job. It's unraveling him. It's causing him to realize that there's a bigger picture, that there's something behind the scenes, that there's something he doesn't understand. There's something beyond his own moment. That there is something bigger that happens that is grander than all that you would ever understand. That God would allow wild donkeys to exist and frolic in the wilderness for God's own pleasure and no other reasons. That dolphins would be in the sea and otters having a great time and laughing it up and having fun for no other entertainment other than God's. You will never see these things happen. You will never know why they happen. But God has built them into the universe for His purposes. And if God chooses to use evil and allow wickedness and allow calamity into your life for His purposes, for His greater picture, Job, why? You don't even understand how this world works. How are you possibly going to understand why I have allowed you to suffer? You have no right to speak to this. Job, Humble yourself before the God who's in control of everything. This is our God.